Well, I'm delighted to be joined today by Secretary of State Jim Baker, also Secretary of the Treasury, also former White House Chief of Staff, and most importantly, our guest today for this conversation on the anniversary of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And so, Secretary Baker, I thought we should take as a starting point for our conversation your views about this moment that we find ourselves in. When you were Secretary of State, it really was one of those hinge moments in history, the period that we would come to see as the end of the Cold War. And I'm wondering what lesson you think the end of the Cold War holds for today's moment. Is this another hinge moment in history that we're living through?
Well, I'm not sure it's the same kind of a hinge moment that we lived through as the Cold War came to an end, Susan, although I do think it could be. We are in the process, in my view, of beginning a Cold War with another adversary, China, an adversary that is every bit as strong, if not stronger, and potentially more dangerous to U.S. interests than the Soviet Union was. Soviet Union was in decline by the time I became Secretary of State in 1989. We still have the problems. We've reverted back to a Cold War with Russia. You know, people forget that for 15 years after the implosion of the Soviet Union, the United States and NATO, the West generally, had good relations with Russia under the governments of both Yeltsin and Putin. People have forgotten that. But I think it's not a stretch to say that we're at the same kind of a moment perhaps in history. Time will tell, but we are in a Cold War with the People's Republic of China. I'm sad to say, because I'm one who pushed very hard when I was in office to get China admitted to the WTO. And we were successful. We thought mistakenly that if she were admitted to that body, she would change some of her behavior and some of her approaches to world affairs and to domestic politics as well. We were wrong. It didn't happen. And it's regrettable that it didn't, and now we find ourselves in a very, at least in the very beginnings, I'm afraid to say, of a Cold War with China, and not to mention the fact that we're back in one with Russia.
Well, a lot of people ask me, well, what are the lessons that we could draw from the successful diplomacy to bring the first big Cold War with the United States and the Soviet Union to a more or less nonviolent ending? And, I guess people forget that our dealings in some ways with the Soviet Union in its final days, certainly your relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev and with Edward Shevardnadze, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, you were closer with them than we are with Russia today in many respects.
That's very true, Susan. And I think that the lessons we learned from the Cold War are lessons that we would be well to remember today. And that some of those were, of course, the fact that don't ever, when you get your enemy behind the eight ball, don't push him too hard. George H.W. Bush understood that. When the wall came down, he didn't dance on the ruins of the wall, even though he's criticized roundly in the United States for not being more emotional about it. But he knew we still had business to do with the Soviet Union, and he didn't stick it in the eye of Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. That's one lesson. Another one, of course, is the importance of personal relationships in diplomacy. It's really important to have the best personal relationship you can with your interlocutor across the table, because you got a hell of a lot better chance of getting stuff done if you have that. That doesn't mean that you compromise your principles and values, or you shade anything in terms of your support for your country. So those are a couple of the lessons. And then the other one, I think, is the importance of strength and consistency in foreign policy. We won the Cold War because every American president, from Harry Truman through George H.W. Bush, was consistent and strong and determined to oppose Soviet expansionism. And we did so, and we won as a consequence. Those are some of the lessons I think we can take from the way the Cold War ended.
You know, it's interesting. I was just looking at this quote from one of your predecessors as secretary the other day, Henry Kissinger, who wrote back in the 60s that the scope for diplomacy is greatest in a period of big change like we're seeing right now, when the old order is obviously disintegrating while the shape of its replacement is highly uncertain. Everything depends, therefore, on some conception of the future. So what was your conception of the future when you realized how quickly the old order was disintegrating? You know, November 9th, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. It's not something that anybody really expected to happen on that day. How quickly did you have a vision of what the future might look like?
Well, we put in place some principles and some structures, some organizations. For instance, we brought Russia into the councils of NATO in a role that was not full membership, but that was a consultative role. That worked for a while. That was the right thing to do. It's too bad that it didn't work forever, but it didn't. We had the view that it was really important that we be there, continue to be there for our longtime allies who had helped us prevail in the Cold War, and we strengthened some of those institutions. Those are some of the things that come to mind as far as I'm concerned.
You know, you mentioned the importance of the personal in diplomacy. At times, you might have found it harder to negotiate with your allies than with your adversaries, both in American domestic politics, maybe on Capitol Hill, but also when, came to the fall of the Berlin Wall. It wasn't just Gorbachev that you were dealing with, or even the Germans, but allies like Margaret Thatcher and Francois Mitterrand were very resistant to that idea.
Absolutely. They did not want to see Germany unified or reunified, whichever term you want to use, because they were afraid history would repeat itself. Germany had started 2 world wars in that century. They were afraid it might happen again if they went along with German unification. I remember Margaret saying, I like Germany so much that I think there ought to be 2 of them in opposing German unification. So we had to overcome the objections, not just of the Soviet Union to German unification, but strong objections from our allies like France and Britain.
When it came to the role of NATO, there was, even to this day, this is one of Vladimir Putin's big sort of grievances as he articulates it against the West. This idea that you in particular pulled some kind of a bait and switch and promised not to expand eastward, but yet did so and created an inevitable future of conflict between Russia and the West by essentially encircling it with a hostile alliance. Can you take us back to what your thinking was about the future of NATO at that time? Why do we even need NATO in a world where there wasn't going to be the Soviet Union anymore?
Well, at that time, we never talked about the expansion of NATO beyond the fact that we were pushing for German unification, and we therefore were supporting the idea of the German Democratic Republic combining with the Federal Republic of Germany to make one unified Germany. But that's the only thing we ever talked about. And even Gorbachev has been quoted as saying, nobody represented to us. I mean, what I said about not moving 1 inch was something said as a hypothetical. in the very early stages of discussions, but it related only to East Germany. And we quickly backed off of it and quickly told the Soviets so. And furthermore, the Soviets signed an agreement in writing, a treaty that provided for that expansion. So for them to come along now and say that somehow we pulled a bait and switch and misrepresented things to them is ridiculous. I mean, I think what happened was Putin got in political trouble domestically. He needed a whipping boy. He found one in NATO, and he's been pushing that narrative ever since. That's one of the reasons that the relationship now between the United States and Russia is so strained.
Do you think that there was a possibility at that time to do a bigger reimagining of the world order? I mean, was NATO really necessary today?
Well, I think we took some steps to do that. As I've mentioned, the Cooperation Council bringing the Warsaw Pact countries into a consultative arrangement with NATO. But NATO, has been the most successful security alliance in history as long as it stuck to defensive security. It's only when it began to get offensive, like marching into Afghanistan and a few things like that, that it didn't succeed and that it came a cropper. But I think NATO, I'm not one who buys the argument that NATO is obsolete. I do think we should have given some consideration to finding a greater role, maybe a bigger role for Russia in NATO. I wrote an op-ed to that effect in the Los Angeles Times in 1993. I caught a lot of grief for suggesting that. Oh, no, the purpose of NATO is to oppose Russia. Well, at that time, it wouldn't have been a bad idea, in my view, to find a way for Russia, because NATO is not only a security alliance, it's a political alliance, and it would have been good to find a greater role for Russia, cooperative role. We didn't do that. I think that was a mistake. I think it was a mistake to push too hard on NATO expansion. I think when people want to embrace Western values, democratic values, if you want to call them that, we ought to encourage it and we ought to welcome them in. That doesn't mean we ought to push it right to the borders. I can understand to some extent how Russia might have felt threatened by some of the expansion that took place after we left office, although I don't think that I would have opposed expanding NATO. I'm not sure I would have done it as aggressively. Let me give you an example. We decided we wanted to build a early warning missile defense system in Poland and Czechoslovakia. Russia came to us and said, wait a minute, you can't do that. That will negate our nuclear deterrent. And we said, well, no, this is not directed against you. This is directed against Iran. And Russia said, fine, we'd like to be a part of it and we'll pay our share. We said, no. Well, that was, if I'd been sitting in Moscow at that time, I would have thought to myself, wait a minute, what's this all about? I think these were mistakes.
What do you think? It's interesting to talk about the role of alliances as you think about, how to construct a new order. And right now, of course, with China, and you have the early stages of what could turn out to be, as you put it, a new Cold War. The United States seems to be once again leaning into the idea of alliances, right? You have both the Trump administration and now the Biden administration embracing the Quad, which is for democratic powers in Asia, and as a sort of a new kind of alliance organized around the possible security challenges of China. Does that make sense to you? Is the Quad going to become kind of the NATO for the East? And what do you think makes sense? Because China is not like Russia and the Soviet Union. China is not a declining power at this point in time, but one that is much more assertive than it has been in the past.
That's correct, and that may be all the more reason why we need to beef up our alliances and create new ones. I don't think there's anything at all wrong with the idea of creating an alliance for the Pacific. Throughout history, alliances have been a force multiplier for American power, for American policy. Our alliances, both in the Pacific and in Europe, have been the source of great strength for America's interest and values and for America's diplomacy. We rely on those alliances. They give us a lot of extra leverage, and they're very important. So I support the building of alliances and the maintaining of alliances.
Secretary Baker, I know we're almost out of time, but I want to ask you just a final question about American leadership in the world right now. You obviously were the secretary at a unique moment in history when the decline of the Soviet Union meant that the United States was in a position of being essentially the world's only superpower. It was a sort of an exceptional moment in history. This is a different moment in history where that is no longer the case, and we seem to be in a world of renewed great power competition. Do you think that the political will exists inside the United States today to maintain a position of international leadership for the United States? There's a lot of indications that on the left and the right, Americans no longer have the zeal for international leadership.
I sadly think you're right on that comment. There indications are that both the left and the right politically in this country are moving away from that, and that is extraordinarily regrettable, because when the United States is involved internationally, we are a force for peace and stability. People know we're not in the game to get into their sandbox, take some of their interest or assets. We don't want it. We're not seeking conquest, and so it's really important that we stay involved internationally, that we stay involved beyond our borders. It enhances the security of the American people, and it's very, very important. We go through these phases of America first, where we say, well, the worst thing in the world is we're sending foreign aid to these countries. Well, sometimes we may go too far in foreign aid, but for the most part, it's a very small percentage of our budget, and we get a great return on it. But more important than anything else is that we remain involved. We are a force. The United States of America is a force for peace and stability in the world when we're involved, and we need to stay involved.
Well, that seems like an important note to end it on. It's, I think, notable that you have at least part of the Republican Party as represented by Secretary Baker, who still remains a proponent of internationalism in the world and American leadership. So I want to thank you for this conversation. I'm sure we both congratulate Ambassador Daalder and the Chicago Council on its anniversary as well. But Secretary Baker, thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Yeah, thank you, Susan.